And welcome everybody to our first Land Bank Association webinar training series. And so I'll ask for some forgiveness if this goes terribly, then say, well, that's just because he was the first one out of the gate. But hopefully this goes pretty well. I have the chat screen up on my other monitors, so I will keep one eye over on it in case questions come up, which I'll raise here. I like to think of this as a dialogue. So as folks have questions or thoughts, and so long as my eye catches that we have a question, let's talk about it. And let's see how far we go. I've got about 30 slides. We've figured that we would talk for about an hour today. So that means we've got plenty of content to talk about on the slides, but even more so, we can just have a dialogue. As Sean said, my name is Jeff Harris. I'm a public finance attorney at Bricker. When I came to Bricker, I brought with my arrival a strong enthusiasm for county land banks in Ohio. I had set up a county land bank and I had run one for a period of time, and I became a true evangelist. I think these land banks are quite interesting. And as we put in my tongue-in-cheek summary of how today's topic would be discussed, I want to leave folks with the idea that there's a lot, well, it says here on the title screen, there's a lot that you can do, irrespective of the fact that we see some of our abilities maybe being truncated, at least in the federal court system, which I understand now the U.S. Supreme Court may be taking up the matter that was in Michigan, the Sixth Circuit case that we now know about. So we know that there's some federal activity there, and you can get into the doldrums about that. And I started a land bank right around the time the hardest hit fund was starting to run out of cash. And I know that was cause for some gloom and doom thinking as well. So what I am going to try to do, what I'm going to strive to do is leave us feeling extra chipper, super bright, feeling really good about what it is we do for our calling as a career, because I think county land banks have a ton of opportunities to maximize in Ohio. So no further ado. Hopefully the slide deck advances. This is always, okay, there we go. For those of you who haven't worked with me individually or with our firm, we are based in Columbus. We have several offices around the state, notably Cincinnati and Cleveland and Dayton, with some smaller offices in Lebanon, Marietta, and Barnesville. Barnesville, we have a lot of oil and gas work coming out of that office. But in April, we are joining with Cincinnati's oldest law firm, Graydon, Head, and Ritchie. So we will be known as Bricker Graydon after April 3rd. And for you all, what's important is we can assist if necessary. There's this and about 2 more slides of shameless plugs. So if you bear with me, I'll get through these and then we can get to the meat of the meeting. But we can, and we actually often do practice in the areas of public sector. Most of my business clients are public sector clients, counties, cities, townships, the state, and county land banks. We also get involved in economic development, public finance, real estate, and tax law, all things that swirl around our county land banks as they operate daily. There's a free resource out there that I'm, I guess, the de facto editor, and that is our Develop Ohio Toolkit. It clocks in at a little over 100 pages. We update this at least once a year for law changes like we saw in the 134th General Assembly, and I updated it last summer. And this is a document that's at that teeny tiny print of a web link at the bottom. Encourage folks to download that if you want. I do have some county land bank discussion there, maybe about 2 or 3 pages, nothing big, certainly everything you'd already know, but it's meant to be an overall view of what it is Ohio's economic development and community development ecosystem looks like. And you'll notice that I'm going to keep peppering this conversation with the idea of economic development. And what I want to instill in folks is that, and I've said this repeatedly, if you've been to my presentations before, I apologize because I'm probably just between the bad dad jokes and the fact that I repeat myself over and over. But if you bear with me, I want to reiterate and instill in us today that county land banks are very much economic development players. And I would argue that they are significant players in Ohio's economic development. So as we think through like, oh man, I can't do my direct transfers out of tax foreclosure with the BOR anymore, or man, oh man, my hardest hit fund, it was gone 2 years ago. I've got to figure out how to raise revenue beyond my DTAC. Let's talk through that, and let's come out with our chest puffed out, because I think there's a lot that county land banks can do and will be doing in economic development. We have a land banking insights email blastogram that we send out, usually at least once a quarter. At the very end of my slide deck is a link that you can type in to sign up for land banking insights if you wish. This one was one, we wrote it a year, actually almost year and a half ago, regarding ARPA cash and really getting at affordable housing and commercial and industrial building demolition money that you can, or uses you can deploy your ARPA to. So if you have an interest in getting regular updates from us as to what is going on in the world of economic development and in the world of land banking, I encourage you to go to that link. Okay, shameless plugs are done. Let's get through things first that you already know. Let's set the table. You know, county land banks are quasi-government entities. You know that they acquire, manage, and dispose of properties. That's their reason for being, right? And the idea that they came about and they are operating heavily to deal with vacant, abandoned, and foreclosed properties. We're going to start to pepper some of our conversation here with the idea that there's a lot more than that. Think through marketable properties, think through arm's length transactions, think through land assembly. Because your aim is always at property's active reuse and paying taxes, but then also maybe there are additional aims we can talk through. Economic development, community development aims that require site control. We know land banks have evolved since the 70s, and we know that they are emerging as an innovative tool to deal with vacant properties and blight. We also know, and we're seeing this emerging as well, and I'll evangelize from the mountaintop, that I think county land banks are extremely valuable public-private partnership tools as well. That's kind of the phrase du jour, right? Like everybody talks about public-private partnerships or P3, or it's the witty sounding phrase, but it's a real thing. And I think county land banks have a significant role to play in those. You already know as well that you can take title usually or often at no cost. You know that your county land bank is the owner of last resort. You know that you can clean up cloudy title, and you know that you can hold property tax free. Hold on that. Wait a second. Let's spin that around in our heads. You hold property tax free. There are significant players in Ohio's development sphere who have a significant interest in seeing property being held tax free. So hold that thought. We'll get back to that here as the slides continue. You secure property from uninvited guests. You dispose of property to new end users. Interesting. Hold that thought too. The idea that it's the side lot programs, sure, absolutely. It's the sales to new homeowners, the young couple who picks up a house and turns it around in the neighborhood. Fantastic. Those are absolutely out of the park success stories. But then there are other things that county land banks can do to marry land that it has under site control with end users who may have a significant role to play in your local economy. Things you already know as well is that county land banks are independent corporations. Hold that thought too, because that's a really important concept. We're going to cover a couple of the thoughts here as to why that is so important. And of course, we know your board makeup is the fact that you've got county commissioners and county treasurer sitting on that board in order to retain power with the local government. We also know, and let's puff out our chests here. This is one of our pride and place comments I'll make, and that is Ohio's Ohio's land banking statutes is among, and you probably already know this, is among the most sophisticated in the entire country. Michigan and Ohio came about in the second generation, dating back to the 1990s. It is the most successful, I would argue, model as we watch them around the country. We know about New York, but Ohio and Michigan have the really interesting concepts because they were intricately drafted when they were written. Every time I talk in front of this group, I always tip my hat to Gus and the work that him and Jim and others did, and David and a lot of folks put in to drafting this model land banking statute scheme we have here in Ohio. Because most importantly, for somebody who does economic development law practice like I do, the fact that it's bolted onto the Community Improvement Corporation model is huge. So let's talk about why is that huge? Well, Ohio Senate Bill 353, which started to expand out our ability to see county land banks all over the state, said that we're going to form county land reutilization corporations as a form. There's two types under Community Improvement Corporation law, or CICs. And importantly, CICs have had a very active and a very prominent role in Ohio in economic development since the 60s. And a question that has come up as I was preparing for today, and a question I've fielded from many clients is, are we private or public? And the answer is yes. But let's talk about that for a second. Are we private or public? Yes. And I was speaking with a colleague to prepare for this call last week, and I said, I'll say it to you this way, and I'll share it with this entire group. If someone were to put me in a life or death situation and said, my goodness, Jeff, if you don't make this call right now, horrible things will befall you. Is a CIC private or public? I'd say, and that includes county land banks, I'd say it's a private nonprofit corporation, period. It's a private nonprofit corporation, period. Who happens to have public members on its board, but the CIC law says that just because you're on the board of a CIC doesn't make it necessarily public. But that private nonprofit corporation, if it has been deemed the electing subdivision, which I believe probably all of us on this call have had their land banks deemed as the electing subdivision, that makes them acting in the public sphere, which means they have to abide by Ohio sunshine laws, which is important. But I come back in this slide deck later on saying it's not necessarily an absolute. There are actually a number of carve-outs for community improvement corporations who don't have to share public records with certain folks, or more importantly, certain information isn't even public in the first place. So are county land banks private or public? Yes. They are private nonprofit corporations that just happen to be operating in the public sphere. And we can talk about that nuance as much as folks want to, or if you're like, no, I got it. I understood. You know, our law director may have already told us that, or your outside counsel. But I want to cover that. So CICs in Ohio, why is it a big deal that county land reutilization corporations are a form of community improvement corporation or form of CIC? It's a huge deal because Revised Code Chapter 1724 has been around since the 60s. And they were primarily focused, if you've ever heard the term IDBs, industrial development bonds, these were a big deal in the 70s and 80s. Primarily in the high inflation era or stagflation era that was really in play back then, because IDBs were issued, although they're taxable, they still could be, in theory, cheaper in order to then gain bond sale proceeds, which could then go into water, roads, sewers to develop industrial parks on the east, west, north, or south side of town. And so that's why most communities in Ohio of a certain size have an industrial park. Probably, I would argue, most of those industrial parks were built by a CIC, and probably most of those CICs that issued IDBs, industrial development bonds, to help get the work done for all the infrastructure that went into those industrial parks. Those CICs that were operating back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, they still continue today. I actually have a number of CIC clients, although they've kind of fallen off in as popular entities more because I think a lot of folks are seeing that they really like port authorities better. We can talk about port authorities in a whole other conversation. But your traditional CIC was formed and has the powers to acquire and sell property, to borrow money, issue debt, to operate revolving loan funds, to serve as an agent for grants, including federal grants. Importantly, to charge fees for folks to do all those nice things that CICs can do. And traditional CICs could also help their local communities in which they had a contract to sell or lease property without having to go through public sale requirements. They could sell property for less than fair market value. They could receive their local government's surplus property without having to go through competitive bidding. I have with a ellipsis here, they can avoid prevailing wage, although we have to be careful because once they're really deemed public, or at least involved in a public project, that idea goes away. But as a private nonprofit corporation, they don't have to abide by prevailing wage law. They can make loans to any person. So these are all things that CICs can do. These are quite impressive. Well, now you add on, you take Senate Bill 353 in 09, and you say, well, we're going to make all of those powers that I just went through available to all of these newfangled county land reutilization corporations. It's a mouthful. Sometimes I mumble, but I have to get it out. That are the second and newest form of CICs, which are sitting out there in 1724-01B2. So B1 says economic development corporations. B2 says, hey, these are what county land reutilization corporations can do, or what they are. And they can do all the things we just covered earlier in the slide deck, which is things we know about: reclaiming property, vacant, abandoned, foreclosed, or other property. Okay, interesting. They can efficiently hold and manage property. Yep, we get that. Okay, that's your county's land reutilization program. Get it. However, but what's this? Assisting governmental entities to assemble land. Interesting. In a coordinated manner. Oh, okay. And then even more importantly, generally promoting economic or housing development. Notice how broad county land bank purposes are stated here. This to me is huge, because when I've talked just anecdotally with some land banks, they say, well, you know, we've gone through the auditor's forfeited lands list, and we've grabbed the things that we really want. You know, we're not doing foreclosures right now in BOR because the damn, you know, attorney Mark Dan and his crew, right? Well, that's true, but look at all these other things county land banks can do. And importantly, 1724, the CIC statute says, hey, if you're a county land bank, you can do all the things in 5722. And 5722 in turn says, hey, anything you're doing under the land banking statutes is not intended to limit in any way, shape, or form who you are as a CIC. Rather, 5722 is additional to all those things that we just covered earlier in a couple slides there, right? So now we say, well, okay, this is cool. So you got community improvement corporations that have extra stuff going on. They actually have statutory dedicated tax revenue, your DTAC. Your run-of-the-mill CIC, actually my practice in the last several years, most of my CIC work has been to wind down CICs because they've just either run out of money or run out of purpose. Well, in this case, county land banks as a CIC actually have statutorily dedicated tax revenue. You guys can go out on the lists at the county's auditor page and figure out which of those do you want, and make notice to the county auditor saying, we'd like this, that, and the other parcel. You can keep your sale proceeds to just continue to drive your land reutilization program. You can take donations of land in lieu. That's a huge one. And I'll sidebar here that I'm on the committee that's helping create this set of training webinars. And I believe an upcoming topic will be how to do it well of taking donations of land in lieu of tax foreclosures, making sure that across the state, all our county land banks are up to speed on this extremely valuable power to county land banks. And again, here it is again. I've already raised it. I'll have to talk about it again, so you'll see where I'm going with this. But the idea that county land banks hold property tax exempt status, and it's automatic by operation of law. That's a huge deal. We'll talk about more about it here in a bit. Oh my goodness, the list keeps going, right? Oh my goodness. So all the goodies, right, in Senate Bill 353 for county land banks as CICs. My goodness, CICs of a county land bank variety are sovereign immune from civil lawsuits, including environmental liabilities. Holy crap, right? That's a big deal, especially when you get a bunch of environmental lawyers in a room saying, what the hell are we going to do with this former power station or landfill or dirty industrial site, the idea that the county land bank holds it immune from state environmental laws, it really gets people's ears to prick up. And then, of course, transferring property to private sector under the land utilization program for whatever purpose to whomever they want, really on whatever terms and conditions the land bank deems necessary. It's a big deal. Okay, so we've acknowledged that there is a certain, I named them already, but there's a certain attorney and other activists in Ohio who don't necessarily like what county land banks are doing and don't like the idea of direct transfers via tax foreclosure in the Board of Revision, or even judicial for that matter. But remember, there are many ways that the county land bank that you're working with can acquire property. Sure, if you get properties from the delinquent lands list or the forfeited lands list, well, actually, rephrase that. It's a huge deal that if you get property from a delinquent lands list or your forfeited lands list, they are cleansed of all title blemishes. Big deal. Now, many of you have been in operation for quite some time. You may have already, gone to the well many times over on the delinquent lands list and the forfeited lands list. We get that. But then we drop down to things that you can do, although sure, yeah, you still have to take it with all the warts and blemishes on title, which is lenders foreclosed properties, donations in lieu of tax foreclosure. So you still have to deal with that, 1989 mortgage sitting out on a property. You can still get the owner to donate it to you. You got to figure out what the hell you're going to do with that mortgage, but it is a way to acquire title. And or actually, quite frankly, one of my favorite is just the fact that as a private nonprofit corporation, you can go out and just do arm's length deals however you want. Now, cash is king. So sure, you could do arm's length purchases all day long, but if you don't have the money to back it up, who cares, right? Understood. But, the purpose of today is just reminding ourselves that there is so much more beyond what I've intentionally put in 9-point font on the screen, which is, yeah, there's tax foreclosures, there's direct transfers from those. They're kind of held in abeyance right now. They're not really doing anything as we watch the courts unfurl, however they're going to treat those. But look at all these other 5 items that we can acquire property. Okay. So we want to think through county land banks as fully vested, fully organized economic development entities in your home community. Almost, you almost want to, shoulder your way into the economic development conversation that may occur. Make sure your county or local economic developer knows about your county land bank or flexes its muscles. Their economic development folks may actually run the county land bank, and certainly I'm aware of that. But let's just make sure we're flexing all the muscles that we have available to us as county land banks in economic development conversations. Because land banks are and can be a public-private partner. There's that P3, that public-private partnership phrase again. So there's the blight clearance projects we're well aware of, but then we get into just straight up land development, park assemblages, land assembly. Economic development deal making requires site control, sometimes on very large pieces of property. And you may have a 10 parcel area of target. 6 of them are able to be either had by the county land bank or is already owned by the county land bank, or could be, it's on the forfeited lands list. But what do you do with the remaining 4 parcels? You deal with them through all those other means, arm's length transactions, donations in lieu. And you can do that in industrial developments, commercial developments. You can do it in housing developments. Real quick, I don't have a slide in here because I'd probably make folks go over the edge because I'm a hammer that sees everything as a nail. And I say that because I'm one of the lead counsel here at Bricker on all things ARPA. And I've bent over backwards yelling that ARPA can and will support using ARPA cash from your local community for affordable housing and for commercial, industrial, and residential building demolition. huge deal. So I know a lot of our communities have already spent down or at least identified where they're going to put their ARPA cash. We just want to make sure that county land banks know that they could help facilitate demolition as well as affordable housing development. So land banks as economic development organizations, although they can't necessarily themselves create a TIF or enact a CRA abatement or an enterprise zone abatement, or they can't themselves create a new community authority or, put in play a new markets tax credit, county land banks can for sure work on a project with a distinct swim lane intended for county land bank involvement to make land ready, to bring folks together as a facilitator. So all these things can happen. All these entities can work together. A port authority coupled with a county land bank is a very powerful 1-2 punch as far as economic development is concerned, particularly when you think your port authorities have statutory exemption from sales tax on construction material in Ohio. That's a huge deal. So then you start to say, well, wait a second, if you've got a county land bank that can hold property by operation of law, tax exempt, coupled with a port authority that can then offer a sales tax exemption on construction equipment, or not equipment, but material, you start to see the real value that a county land bank has. And you notice none of this has anything to do with direct transfers via tax foreclosure, not a thing. It's just the fact that a county land bank exists as an entity that can make real stuff happen. So if we think about county land banks as economic development organizations, well, I've already covered a couple of them, but we want to make sure that we address the fact that there are more powers held by a county land bank than just your other run-of-the-mill economic development organization, particularly an economic development organization that's embedded within a county or embedded within a city or a township. A county land bank has much more set of authority and powers than even those governmental housed economic development groups. Because we know that a community improvement corporation is excluded in very particular ways from Ohio's sunshine laws. We know that 1724-11 says that, hey, as far as public records go, if a CIC / a county land bank ever receives financial or proprietary information from a business who's interested in a deal, that those financial and proprietary items of information never become public. So if somebody were to call on the county and say, hey, I want to see the financial information that was supplied by ABC Corp for that deal down the street, and the county reaches out to you and says, hey, do you guys have that financial information? You can say, yeah, we have it, but it's not public. It's sitting in our files. We're a private nonprofit corporation. That financial information under the CIC statute that I have here never becomes public. Any other information that a business may give to a county land bank as part of a deal-making negotiation stays non-public. So any other information that may come into the possession of a county land bank until the business says, okay, fine, we're going to move forward with the project. In which case, then if somebody were to ask for certain information, like, okay, what particular sites are they looking at within a community? All right, that's not financial, it's not proprietary. That would be information you'd have to share, but only if the company made public that they're going to commit to move forward with the project. If a company never moves forward with a project, all of that information that the CIC is holding, that the county land bank is holding, remains non-public. Similarly, on the Opens Meetings Act under Ohio's sunshine laws, CIC boards can close their meetings and politely ask all media and members of the public to leave, talk about any of the information I've just laid out. Of course, they can't, in those closed meetings, take any official action. They have to come out of that closed meeting setting. But those CICs / county land banks can certainly close their meeting to discuss things that are otherwise non-public. Very helpful. And this is a slightly higher level of exemption or exclusion from Ohio sunshine laws than your city councils, than your county commissioners. Because if you follow Public Meetings Act, there are 8 ways you can get executive session. Economic development deals is certainly one of them. But the idea that all this information that the CSC is holding may never become public is a huge deal, and allows more control of the conversation and framing of the issue at the local level by use of the county land bank, because it's a CIC. This is one, this slide, and again, I don't see any chat questions coming in. I'm happy to take any questions or thoughts. Maybe this is a call to action here. This is a huge deal, and we've been toying with this here at the firm. The idea that county land banks hold property exempt from real taxes, real property taxes, just because, right? So any land acquired and held by a county land bank essentially operates as an absolute exemption. The exemption is available to the county land bank by operation of law, so you don't have to apply to the county auditor. You don't have to apply to the Ohio Department of Taxation. It's just, it comes into the possession, it comes into the title of the county land bank, and that property is now exempt from real property taxes. Now, the question is, and we've been seeing this a little bit in the state in the last several years, and I'd be curious if anyone had any examples they wanted to share, is what happens if the county land bank stays as the owner of a property, and that property then is of extreme interest or value to a private for-profit developer, and that property is leased to that developer. Does that keep the exemption in place as long as the county land bank owns that property? There's a significant amount of dialogue, at least I've had it with other attorneys, saying, yeah, I think it does. I think it does. I think as long as the county land bank owns property, it's a supersized exemption. So for those of you who know what your counties and cities are doing as far as community reinvestment area or enterprise zone abatements, you know that those tap out after 15 years. This idea that you could hold property in perpetuity and that exemption is in place the entirety of the time that you own it, 25, 30, 35, 40 years, is a huge deal. And it gets people really interested when I say that in rooms with developer interests as a possible way to get a deal done. Questions come up. Sean, you've asked, are there any examples of land bank holding property for long-term tax exemption? I'm only aware of research that has gone into multifamily housing development in Cuyahoga County. I'm only aware of that. I have not in my own practice seen a land bank hold property for a long period of time with the idea of keeping it. Because if we go back to the purposes, or at least what we know is our reason for being, county land banks are all about trying to return property back to productive use in tax status. And that's probably one of the key ways you got your county treasurer to sign on to this concept that, okay, fine, I'll go down the county land bank formation route, but doggone it, I want to get paid as treasurer once that property is back to full taxable status. Understanding that, I think it's important to point out here that there may come a time in everyone's career at their land banks where you have a significant piece of property that may be of a significant value for economic development, that maybe you say to yourselves, hey, you know what, treasurer, we know you wanted this property returned to productive use for tax purposes, but maybe that property sits in the land bank and we determine a way to charge a lease rate on it, and those lease revenues are somehow shared back to you, county treasurer, to make up the difference. But the entire time that you do that, that county land bank holds the property tax exempt. Think about the developers who'd have a real interest in that. Let's see, question Alande has asked, Jeff, does tax exemption apply to a land bank's wholly owned subsidiary? I don't know. That's a good question. So if you have, I assume like if you have an LLC you formed that operates underneath your county land bank, It all would depend, at least as far as this 572211 is concerned, with who holds title to the property. So if it's the county land bank holds title to the property, yes, I would argue the exemption here applies. If the LLC holds property title in name, I'd say probably not available. Which actually then raises a question, and I'm not allowed to, I don't mean to pick on you or anyone else. I've actually had clients say, hey, we've got this county land bank. Should we now form an LLC off to the side? And my argument has been, you don't need to, because a county land bank is a private nonprofit corporation formed under Ohio's nonprofit corporation law, chapter 1702. You got a lot of arrows in the quiver as it is. And the LLC allows you to operate anonymously. Right. Okay. So Doug then is, I've got it. My next slide actually, Doug, goes to that very point. But the idea that if you've got an LLC that holds it, at least 572211 may not apply, but let's talk through the next slide. Doug, you've responded to the group. 570912F also comes into play here. And that is any property that's acquired and held by a county land bank not otherwise exempt under 5722 is deemed to be a public purpose and otherwise exempt until sold or transferred. So Doug, your comment to everybody, wholly owned would be tax exempt under 570912. There's two ways that I read these two provisions together. And I've seen some debate among attorneys. I actually think 5722 on the previous slide, if I can go back, 11 covers us as far as land banks are concerned, because 57 or 0912 here says not otherwise exempt under 5722. And when we think about how did you get land under 5722, 11, it came in under your land reutilization program, right? Well, remember, your land reutilization program allows you to acquire land even at arm's length. So I've seen some legal views using 570912F to get to the same place. I'm of the view that you don't even necessarily have to go there to get to this level of treatment. Happy to have any conversation. Anybody want to unmute? This is the topic here that I really want to dive into today, because I think as far as county land banks as valuable economic development partners, this is about one of the key ideas. Okay. Absent that, really towards the last slide. Yeah, Doug. Sean, can you unmute Doug? There we go.
Hi, Jeff.
Hey, Doug.
So the history behind 570912, there is, I think, some ambiguity in whether or not a land utilization program can take properties into it that are not coming in through the tax foreclosure statute. So not coming in through 5722 or 5723. Mm-hmm. So when we started in Cuyahoga County, what was happening was there were a lot of parcels that were being transferred from the county land bank after they were demolished to municipal land banks. And there was a question whether or not that transfer, when the cities were acquiring the properties, are they exempt by operation of law, or do we have to go and file the exemption forms? And so there was already sort of this exemption set out in 570912. Mm-hmm. So in Senate Bill 172 is when we kind of created this thing that was like a catch-all. You know, maybe it's a bit of belts and suspenders, but it was basically saying that if you acquire something into a land reutilization program, or if the county land bank, you know, acquires it and it's coming in from a source, and it was kind of already clear for county land banks. So this was more for the municipal land banks. Okay. That if something flows in and you are like declaring this to be a land reutilization program property, that you can do that, and it can come in from any other source, arm's length transaction, just a donation, land, you know, county land bank to municipal land bank, and it was intended to just sort of cover that. I do think that, you know, there is like one part in 5722 where it seems to mention other property that could be acquired into it. So this sort of embraces that too. So that was it. And what we were just trying to further say, and this is not existing law yet, but you know, the best practice that we kind of came up with here is, you know, you really need to identify the property as being a land utilization program property, you know, sort of in grantee's name, so that the auditor knows, okay, this is what this is. It's not just going to say City of Cleveland. You know, you have to basically identify it that way. So that was kind of the history of that 570912, you know, why it is. But yeah, it's kind of it's just there as a catch-all, in my opinion.
Doug, thank you so much for that comment. I really like that. And did everyone catch that best practice tip right there? So for those of you who are handling those conveyance instruments, your deeds, the idea that you would include in the grantee name, comma, for land reutilization program allows you under either 572211, which I have here, or the one Doug just talked about, 570912, to let the county auditor, county treasurer know that, hey, this property is exempt from taxes. I would take Doug's comment even further to say, not only do you have 572211 out there in Ohio law, you know, passed by the Ohio General Assembly, blessed by the governor at the time, saying these properties held by county land banks are real property tax exempt. You then have the catch-all in addition saying that same thing in 570912. So you have two forms of statutory bestowing a real property tax exemption on county land banks. Huge deal. Now, as I was preparing for this call, I was speaking with Sean and others on our team, and I said, I haven't seen these play out yet in any real form in terms of county land bank holding property, tax exempt, then keeping that property, and then doing a capital lease structure to a private for-profit developer who then rents the land. I haven't seen this play out yet. And if you followed the lame duck session of the last General Assembly, we know that the Ohio Historic Preservation Tax Credit was rewritten to remove LIHTC projects from eligibility. And the word on the street is that Senator Huffman found out about a project in Lima that had tried to include LIHTC with Ohio Historic Preservation Tax Credit, and he was chagrined. And so that law was changed to remove LIHTC from historic preservation tax credits in the state. I share that because it could be, and if anyone has a comment, they want to reach out to me offline, or even if you want to comment here, it could be that if we saw this tax exemption play out in a for-profit developer circumstance, that we could see that generate enough hand-wringing in the Ohio State House that could suggest a change or not, because Ohio Department of Taxation hasn't weighed in on this. It hasn't been tested in the courts, to my knowledge. This is a really, to me, this is cutting edge. This is about as cutting edge as you can get in county land bank law in Ohio at the moment. And again, remember, this has nothing to do with direct transfers out of tax foreclosure. This is just, these are your statutory powers you have available to you right now. Okay. All right. Okay. Patrick asks, is that implied? See, Patrick, you're asking, is that implied through 1724A3, which is the CSC statute, where it discusses lease property so long as it doesn't exceed certain limits? Maybe. So, Patrick, you raise a good question. And that's why I always keep one of these corporation handbooks around, because I have to, even though I've read CSC law 100 times, you always have to pick up the book, right? Let's see, 1724. Well, I don't know that the powers and duties of CICs, which is 1724-02, I don't know that there's anything in there that would restrict this idea of using the tax exemption. And remember, Chapter 5722 says, and we had it up on the screen several slides ago, it says nothing in Chapter 5722 should be construed to limit what a CIC can do under its own 1724 code. That's a really key point. So, Patrick, to your question, I'm not sure, but I think the authorities would rule or at least be on our side to say that I think the exemption is available irrespective of how a CIC or a county land bank sets up the lease. Okay, other questions, comments, thoughts? And Sean, if we want to unmute folks, or if folks want to raise their hand, or
everyone can unmute themselves now.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sean. And I will threaten folks that if there are no further questions, I will regale you with my thoughts on the Guardians post or off-season pickups for ball players. So please don't make me do that. You'll see how ignorant I am on baseball. But happy to take any questions or thoughts from folks.
Well, here in Wayne County, this is just a little above all of our heads because we're a pretty young land bank, just a couple of years old, and we have been able to use the land bank to a huge benefit to acquire properties, but that's really all we've been able to do with it is the land reutilization.
Mm-hmm.
But it has been a great tool,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm very interested in what you're saying here. We're talking obviously with Bricker and Eckler all the time about our CIC and what we can use there, and this is very interesting that how they can work hand in hand together. So I thank you for this.
Oh, no, thank you. And that appreciate that comment. And please, no one should be intimidated, whether young, land bank, or old, from any of this conversation. This is really meant to be like osmosis, right? Like to just kind of plant seeds that, okay, there's the drug houses down, the one corridor we're trying to refurbish, and there's the properties that, have got 10-foot tall, grass on it that we're dealing with. But then there's all this other stuff. And if we don't lose sight of all this other stuff, and you come back from time to time to this PowerPoint deck that Sean's going to share with you, hopefully it may be a problem solver the next time you're in a meeting with somebody and they say, well, we don't know how to deal with this challenge in our community. Okay.
So I'm kind of embarrassed to ask this question because of, well, I just am, but did you allude earlier, are you saying that land banks are not sales tax exempt?
The land banks are not sales tax exempt for development deals. Now, there's an argument, right? And I'm not a sales and use tax attorney, so I want to be real careful here. We know that port authorities are vested under Ohio statute to have to be able to pass on the sales tax exemption to development projects that they take a part in. Okay, land banks of your own purpose, paper purchases, copier, yada yada yada, for your own operations, you may make the argument that you're sales tax exempt because you're operating at the behest of your county or your city, right? But a CIC, a county land bank, does not have a sales tax exemption built into it, as, for example, port authorities do.
Well, I guess what I'm referring to is like if we renovate a structure ourselves under our ownership, we pay the bills to buy materials.
Right.
Those materials are sales tax exempt.
That sounds okay. That's kind of like my copier and paper operations for, yeah. Well, and remember, Rick, I'm not a sales and use tax attorney. And actually, I should have done this at the start. Please, everybody, I'm not dispensing legal advice. I'm not your lawyer. Actually, some of you I am, but for most of you, I'm not. Rick, you sound like you're in the good. It sounds okay. It's just where port authorities can then bring in private developers and large projects and say the entirety of this thing is sales tax exempt on construction material.
Right.
Okay.
And that's a change that was in Senate Bill 112. And now it's going to be reintroduced. But what we're trying to do is basically give county land realization corporations the same exempt status that a port authority would have. So even for when the developer or the contractor buys material for a land bank project, that would be exempt, because I think it's ambiguous whether there's an exemption or not, because it's not express.
Doug, if I could, I would hug you through the Zoom platform, because if we're successful seeing Senate Bill 112 reintroduced in the current General Assembly and it passes with that provision in it, to me, this slide deck just grows by additional powers, additional excitement around county land banks, because so much of our Port Authority practice here at Bricker are private development deals who want full access to that sales tax exemption. And the idea that county land banks would have that same ability. In fact, I've counseled clients to say, should I do Port Authority or should I do a county land bank CIC? And I'm like, well, if you want the sales tax exemption for a large scale development, go Port Authority. But Doug, if you are reading some tea leaves and we're able to see this come to about, wow, that to me would be a game changer, everybody. Okay, cool.
We're hoping that that gets reintroduced shortly. We have at least a couple sponsors interested, so we're working on that now.
Yeah, I was watching it with interest. It had a lot of activity last General Assembly. Let's see if it can't pick up some steam again. Other questions or thoughts, folks? And David, did I address? You had raised a question, everybody. Did we get you, David, on sales tax with that conversation we just had?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you, David. Okay, I guess I wasn't truthful at the start when I said there's all these shameless plugs. Here's my last one. There's my name, my email. If you want to get a hold of me, I'm happy to talk with folks, happy to have these conversations. Don't worry, you can reach out and ask questions, and I won't start some magic meter and then send you a bill unannounced. Let's just chat. And then the final thing, we do have at this link here a subscription link for our insights, which includes the ability to check box our land banking insights, which reminds me, I probably have to write an article for that now that I think about it. But Sean, at this point, I think, how long have I talked? Just about an hour. So happy to take questions or turn it over.
Are there any additional questions?
I'm a Rich Fender from the Marion County Land Bank. You mentioned sovereign immunity that land banks have. So how does that work in liability situations?
Right. There is a significant carve out. I go to my 5722. Go back here. You bear with me. 5722.22. It's the last section of the county land bank, or the land banking statute generally. It says the county land bank is not liable for damages, so that's legal, or equitable remedies, so think injunction, and other type of declaratory actions or things of that nature, among a number of listed sections of Ohio Revised Code, just by virtue of the county land bank owning the property. So that civil immunity is a huge plug when I'm sitting in rooms with private development interests and we're trying to figure out how do we solve an issue. I say, oh, not only is it exempt, not only do we have these other powers, not only can the county land bank do CIC things, it's also immune from civil suit in a number of areas of Ohio law while it holds the property. And I think that's a really important point. Thank you for the question.
There's also immunity under 2744. A county land realization corporation is, for the purposes of that section, deemed to be a political subdivision. So you have some tort liability as well. So long as you're operating sort of within, like doing land bank stuff.
Yeah.
So that's never really, we had one case where up here, I don't know if anybody's really explored that at all, which is a good thing. But it's just another section there that gives some protection.
Yeah. Thank you, Doug.
So if you have third parties involved, then that can affect how that liability. There's like people doing rehabbing work on land bank property, but that would be in keeping with the whole purpose of the land bank if you want to rehab as well as demolish.
Right. Right, because 5722.22 lists the county land bank itself is not liable, right? So
that would mean that a party, if there was an injury, they would have difficulty actually suing the land bank.
Right. Yes, I'm with you. Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Luke asks, who's going to try that commercial leasing idea first, right? Luke, I'm honest. We have been talking about this very fact pattern within the firm for probably 2.5 years. And I have been waiting for the day that we see a client want to push forward on this. We don't know, Luke. Like Doug said on the civil immunity front, there's not a whole lot of challenge on the immunity side. I'm not aware of anything that has brought any court review of this absolute exemption under 572211 or 570912. I'm very curious how this plays out.
Jeff, can I ask a question?
Mhm.
This is Kelly from Hamilton County. On the acquisition of properties through the delinquent land list, we acquire a lot through the forfeit land list and then obviously through foreclosure, but we've not attended anything just through the delinquent land list. I don't really know, I mean, procedurally wise, I mean, I can, kind of figure that out through the folks at the treasurer's office, but I guess I'm curious how that would, like, how does that go with clearing title?
My only involvement, and there are probably others on this call who are much, much more versed on this than, my knowledge from the land banking code book is that land bank makes the prosecutor aware that an ongoing action, hey, we want dibs on that particular parcel. And then of course the property upon adjudication is then advertised differently. And the land bank has a play at it. So in my slide that was earlier, if I made a mistake there, it was that I suggested you could just go out in the delinquent land list and just get it. So that's probably on me if there's some confusion there.
Oh, okay. I got really excited there for a minute.
Oh.
It's like, oh, once it's declared delinquent, I mean,
Oh, right,
certainly we can't just go snatch it
right.
without like some due process and whatnot. Okay.
Yes.
Am I
I'm
missing
sorry about that.
something? Okay.
Yeah.
I thought, have I missed a huge like tool in our arsenal? Okay. Thank you.
No, you just caught me probably rushing through that slide. So thank you for that clarification and the opportunity to correct that, everybody.
Well, I got eager is the problem. So thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any other questions?
Jeff, in one of your slides, I think in talking with about the economic development CIC, you had the ellipse at the end of prevailing wage.
Yeah, right.
And what is your view? What is your viewpoint? Now with a county land utilization corporation CIC and prevailing wage.
Doug, great question. The way I'd analyze it, and this is the worst way to practice law, right? Here on the, on a live feed. But the way I'd analyze it is prevailing wage, as far as my practice is concerned, is triggered by the involvement of a government in Ohio whose money is going into a deal. So we could argue that a private nonprofit corporation that is a county land bank doing its own thing without state or local funds would be able to avoid prevailing wage in terms of using perhaps its own budgetary resources. But then of course you'd want to think through, how did those budgetary resources come into play in the county land bank's coffers? But if the county land bank is deploying federal is Davis-Bacon, this whole thing, if the county land bank is deploying state or local funds in a project, then I would suggest that prevailing wage is going to apply, just in a general sense. Of course, I'm not a prevailing wage attorney either, but I've been around enough economic development deals that those are usually the triggers that we see on prevailing wage. What do you think, Doug? Did I win you over?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of where I'm at too. Which I think it's sort of unfortunate because there's a wide variety of type of projects that a county land bank would be undertaking. And so, yes, I mean, we could be doing, if we wanted to, big infrastructure type projects that are more akin to like the type of public improvement that I think that the prevailing wage statutes are meant to embrace.
Right.
But when you're talking about, the renovation of an abandoned home,
right,
to me, that doesn't seem to be the type of public improvement that you even have the interest of the type of contractor that is bidding on big public jobs anyways, you know?
Right.
And so I'm interested in sort of exploring, you know, the boundaries of, you know, the interpretation of the prevailing wage to see is there, you know, some projects that, you know, are subject to it, or other projects that are not, beyond sort of just the, you know, the monetary threshold.
Yeah.
But it is kind of a question about, you know, is a CIC or a county land realization corporation, you know, like a public authority? Anyway, so I don't know. I mean, I tend to think yes, and we've been sort of, you know, the Land Bank Association through like ODOD, at least, you know, for right now, it seems like the authorities in Columbus sort of feel that we are public authorities, you know, under that statute. And then it's a question of, are you meeting the monetary threshold, or is, you know, this sort of a public project, or a public improvement then?
Hey, Doug, I think you may have just hit Sean for our group, or maybe a topic for this year's webinar series. I would find that fascinating, Doug, and I'd be happy to lend a hand if anybody wanted to think through putting that on as a topic or bringing it up for a discussion. I think those are some good questions you raised, Doug. Jeff Benton asks, could the land bank do a construction project for a public building and not have to do prevailing wage? Jeff, I'd say, to Doug's point, that's one that we want to analyze. I'd say if the land bank is involved, I'd say Department of Commerce is probably going to say it's prevailing wage, especially if there's government funds being handled by the county land bank, then yes. Depending on the thresholds for new construction and renovations. I believe that's right. Jeff Benton also asks, is bed tax revenue considered public funds? I would argue yes, when involved in property improvement. I would say yes. Tax revenue of really whatever source would be considered public, would probably trigger that analysis. These are good questions. I've probably gotten outside of my own law practice swim lane about 4 times a day. So please, I know it's being recorded, but nobody write down what my answers were on some of the sales and use tax questions or prevailing wage. But these are fascinating conversations.